All right, as people join in, we'll get them in the conversation, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today about corporate justice and equity-driven leadership, talking about all things accountability. My name is Christina Giordano. I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. For folks who aren't familiar with AllVoices, we're an employee feedback management platform that really focuses on getting that anonymous feedback to report things from harassment, bias, culture issues, and really submit those to company leadership. And we submit that to them so they can really take action on the feedback that they are given, and they can get that real-time feedback, have that proactive data, and really prevent any systemic problems from happening. To set the stage for this conversation, we're looking at corporate social justice as defined as a reframing of CSR, so corporate social responsibility, that centers on an initiative or program strategy that is measurable of the lived experiences of groups that have been historically harmed or disadvantaged by society. A lot of the conversations that we had last June 2020 were after George Floyd's murder, and separately in July 2021 after the Atlanta shooting. Today, we're going to discuss how diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders and leaders at large can really hold themselves accountable and talk about strategy and things that you can't read from an article. I also want to acknowledge that today is the start of the celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month. And if you have any questions from the audience, please feel free to put them in the chat, send them directly to one of us, and we will do our best to answer. So with that, I'll pass for introductions. If you could share your pronouns, role, and just the work you do at your company, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of the conversation. We'll go Ash, DK, Ulysses, and Gary, to remember that order.
Sounds great. Thank you, Christina. My name is Ash Coleman. My pronouns are she, they. I work at Credit Kallma. I'm the head of diversity, equity, inclusion. My job is around the strategic matter in which we implement diverse, inclusive, and equitable practices into our organization's bottom lines. How do we bring folks closer to what our initiative is, both externally and internally, when it comes to bringing about success financially and independently for our customers, our member base, and for our employees?
DK Bartley, Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Moody's Corporation. We are very focused on really enhancing our overall DE&I strategy. DE&I has really become a part of the DNA of our company in all aspects: the employees, our customers, our business, our community relationships, and even our board. So I'm really excited to be here and a part of the conversation around DE&I, transparency, and accountability.
My name is Ulysses Smith, cis not cis. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I serve as the head of diversity, inclusion, and belonging for Blend. We are a fintech company and white label software platform specializing in digitizing the mortgage process as well as other consumer banking products. We're based in San Francisco. I'm based in San Francisco, and I get the joy of leading not only our diversity, equity, and inclusion work, but also overseeing Blend Impact, which is our environmental, social, and governance remit of work as well. So excited to be part of this conversation as we really talk through how we're able to do that, both not only through our workforce, but really through the product that we build itself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gary Hale. Pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the diversity and inclusion lead at a company called Parametric based out of Seattle. We are a financial investment management company. Recently just acquired by Morgan Stanley, so might have seen that in some headlines and news. So my role is really to lead all the efforts internally, externally, just like the folks on this call, and how we think about DEI and how that's infused into the business that we do, and then the way that we treat our employees and the type of space that we're creating for people to really thrive and feel like they belong here at Parametric. I've been there about a year, and I've done some work in government space and nonprofits around DEI as well, and excited to be here today.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for spending some time with us this afternoon. I want to kind of start off the conversation with specifically racial injustice, and a lot of companies who leaned in last year, or I should say a year and a half ago at this point as well, making bold statements around Black Lives Matter and around how they aren't where they need to be as an organization leading with vulnerability. Now we're at a point where we can see some change, systemic changes, both large and small, for leaders, processes, or initiatives. I want to ask the folks that are here if you've seen changes at your organization, both large and small. And if you have seen changes in the kind of community at large, do you think that, these statements and these commitments and this kind of holistic process has seen some progress?
All right, let's not all talk at once. So I'll start. At Moody's, I think when you talk about change, and particularly with DE&I, we're a great example, not only within our sector, that's financial services and technology, but I think as a really corporate responsible organization, we began this journey before George Floyd, so we have a nice kind of caveat of saying we didn't do this because of George Floyd. I think George Floyd just really kind of put laser focus on the things that we were doing. And some of these changes are things like reverse mentoring, right? Where, for us, it's not just about learning, developing, and training from the top, but also from the bottom up. So we have a whole program around reverse mentoring where our young professionals, not necessarily young, our more mid-level professionals as well, really educate our senior level professionals that are managers that may come from a different time and a different period. And why that's important is that it's not just about diversity around culture or ethnicity, it's also diversity around age. And when you look at diversity around age, it's also generational. And, so there's a whole lot of exponential benefits around having a reverse mentoring program. We clearly do diversity, equity, and inclusion training globally, and there's a mandate that everyone in our company goes through it. So that's huge. But one of the things I think that really makes us really different and that we see is working really well every day, there's a video, I'll do a plug, that's going to come out later today. So if you're linked into me on LinkedIn, you could watch the full video on our reverse mentoring program, is how we have conversations, how we communicate. It's powerful because you have a lot of senior leaders who take the George Floyd conversation around, wow, I never thought of it that way. I never thought of what my children have to go through when they go outside, because I just assume that everybody's going to do what they do. And it's like, no, there are other people that the minute that child opens the door, it's a whole different world and it's a whole different feeling and a whole different concern. So I think that's huge. And so for me, the change is really about how we communicate, this level of transparency, of unfolding your arms and saying, that you may not say the right thing, but there's a lot of empathy in the conversation and the hope that we're going to give you the grace to kind of say that even though you may not say it the right way, you're communicating with me, and I think it's going to lead us to a better place.
I really appreciate what DK said about empathy. I know that that's the last thing he mentioned, but speaking to that, that's one of our core values at Credit Karma, is really making sure that folks understand where folks are coming from, not only from an internal perspective again, but as we put products out into the world for our members, thinking generationally, as you were just talking about. Financial stability and success really is that piece that helps folks be able to build the futures that they want, and more importantly, that they need. When we talk about justice, it's about dropping those barriers and also those reinforcements that continue to be needed until we get to that place of equal access. And so us, with our focus externally, is making sure that people have access to those materials for free and always for free. But internally, that's impactful for folks who are working with us as well, because we are very much on a path of making sure that we are seeing the historically excluded folks brought into the organization so that we can impact them where they are right now as well. Making sure that there's equitable practices on how we hire, how we maintain folks at the company, how we provide opportunities for them to learn and grow, and just to build careers that are going to be fruitful for now and into the future. We really need to continue talking about how we're bringing access to a number of the things that were kept from these folks for so long. And a lot of that is paying attention and bringing folks into tech. And so through things like structured interviewing, which I'm happy to talk about later, I don't want to take up too much time because I know there are panelists who want to speak to this particular point as well, but structured interviewing and recruiting, that's really strong for us, making sure that we are grasping into those communities that have unfortunately been left behind in this conversation for a long time.
Ulysses, can you touch a little bit on how you think about kind of Blend and the kind of products and kind of the equity that you kind of provide externally as well, and how you work with product leaders too? I think oftentimes we might start with people, internally, employees, which is really important too. And holistically at the same time, we could be looking, as Ash talked about as well, the product, services, and just the mission of the company to make an impact as well.
I think you're spot on. And what both Ash and DK mentioned, I think is incredibly valid, right? In order for us to actually build equitable products, we actually have to have a diverse workforce that represents our customer base and understands the context of the problems that people actually want to solve, right? And understanding what that actual lived experience is like. And like everybody else on this panel, Blend had long been doing D&I work well before my own arrival at the organization, and bringing in my acquired taste of a vision, I'm sure, and approach to the organization. And for that, I commend them. And frankly, had Blend ever asked me to explain the business case for the work I do, I would never have signed. This is the only company I've worked for that has never asked me to do that, because it is something that's absolutely ingrained in the mission. It is to create an open and accessible consumer banking ecosystem. And look, you know, when the pandemic happened, and then shortly followed by the events surrounding George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, it wasn't the first time we were having a conversation about racial equity, but it did provide a unique opportunity for us to really sit down as an entire company, leadership team involved, executives as well, and actually talk about what our place in the ecosystem was, in the entire financial services ecosystem really was. We work with banks. We know there's a deep history, and I'm sure both Ash and DK know, especially, actually everybody on this panel should know at this point, because we're all kind of in the same space, right? The complicated relationship that many communities of color especially have with financial institutions and banks, and the distrust that is there. And so are we complacent? There's this question of, are we complicit, not complacent? Are we complicit in some of the ills that are being perpetuated on some groups? And how can we work with our customers who are banks to actually help better deliver a set of financial services that will ultimately drive more equitable outcomes and get to some of the establishment of generational wealth that Ash was just referring to in these conversations. And so that's what actually got us to the point of architecting the Equitable Ecosystem Initiative and really starting to work intentionally both with customers as well as our industry partners like the National Bankers Association, who is a trade association for all minority depository institutions, to really understand what the priorities should be in full and to start to build those out. So I think, yes, absolutely investing in talent acquisition initiatives is critical. But what businesses really have to do now is really start questioning fundamentally, should we be changing the way we do business? And how do we infuse these principles around DEI into every good, service, or product that we're putting out into the market?
The one thing I would add, just off of like Ash talking about empathy being this value, and then Ulysses talking about like the product and thinking about the way that we're interacting with clients and customers, and thinking about how do we become a more representative company in all these different aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion. I think for us, we use this moment as this energy to thrust us forward. The conversations were happening. It was like there was work already being done within the company, but now it provided this space where I feel like everybody could come to the table and then just start to voice their thoughts and their opinions and their feelings whether it was how our culture was and how they felt treated within the workplace, but then also the impact of the work that they do externally outside of our walls. And so I think that's where I saw a lot of the energy and thinking about like, what's the change that's really happened? It's helped us to move this conversation forward in a whole new dynamic type of way that we previously just hadn't seen. And so I think being able to lean in like that, my hope is that this conversation just stays at the forefront of all of our minds across corporate America and across the globe, so that we can continue to make this impact that we want to see happen in the world.
I want to go back to Ulysses' point around the business case, because I think this comes up still a lot in conversations in terms of what is the ROI, what KPIs can I look to if I'm going to donate time, money, and resources to diversity and inclusion initiatives, just like a product. How do I know we're doing a good job? And there is a line you have to toe with if you're over indexing or over relying on metrics, if you're tokenizing people, if you are just doing it to hit this goal. What is your kind of advice for measuring the progress, sure, but also not relying on these metrics to tell you how you're doing? Is it just the qualitative data from employees telling you how they feel, if they are inclusive? What are your thoughts there? You're muted.
You're muted.
Of course, I'm living in 2020 still. That is an excellent question. And the reason why is, particularly with us, similar to a lot of companies, there's this belief that diversity is a number, right? It's, you do this, you get that, that's the result, and we're done. That is absolutely, and I'm sure everyone on this panel will tell you that, absolutely what not DE&I is about, right? And it never ends. It's this continuous journey, right? Even when you reach to the point where you could say that you have dynamic diversity and it's everywhere and it's, your policies, et cetera. For me, and I've been doing this about 20 years now, the most important thing is the behaviors. And that should be your number one indicator of, is it working? Are things changing? As I said, the conversation, the way you communicate, your policies, is there a conversation when you're developing a new policy on, who's not included in this policy? What don't we have, right? You're solving for one problem, but hopefully you're not creating another one. When you're going out to get new business, are you focused on multicultural business? Or are you just focused on, the business that you always have, or just increase in margin? You can always increase margin, but if you're not including everyone, or the word other, are you really being diversified? So those are some examples, but I use those examples because, even if you don't hit the diversity first time out with getting new business, getting new employees, promoting employees, et cetera, if you have the behaviors, it shows a consciousness to enhance and improve. And that's how you start to do better. And that's how you learn. So for me, the number one answer, and you will always need the data, you'll always need the demographics and the metrics, is the behavior, the good faith efforts. And then if you're doing the good faith efforts, it's like a ball game. As long as you keep hitting, as long as you keep swinging, you're gonna hit something.
There are no reactions. I hear my emojis are going different Zooms. So I was looking for all the reactions to be like, yes, absolutely. You preach that gospel. This is a sermon, because behaviors are critical, right? And that's actually how you see, that's how we should be measuring change. One of the things I note when we measure, because I think you mentioned engagement surveys and measuring kind of the qualitative experience of employees, which is absolutely important. One of the questions we changed on our engagement surveys before was, does Blend demonstrate a commitment to diversity? And to me, that was such a whack question. I was just like, sure, we say it all the time. We talk about it. Y'all hear from me probably too much.
Right.
But what I want to know is, does Blend's executive leadership team demonstrate a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? That's a question to say, how do you show up? How does this leadership team show up? Very different answers, right? And it got our leadership team really thinking, wow, I show up to some of these things, I say some of these things, I talk about it, but clearly I have not shown up in a way that has been consistent with the messages that we've been putting out as an organization. And being able to have data, reliable data like that, of that qualitative experience, to understand how the workforce is experiencing you and that stated commitment, is a very different thing, right? And being able to leverage that to then be able to go out and explore new possibilities, whether that be talent acquisition initiatives that some of the things DK was talking about, or removing a lot of the arbitrary barriers to workforce participation that Ash touched on. These are the things that we actually have to start addressing. But that actually does lead us to this question around some of the other metrics that we don't think about when we talk about DEI as a practice, right? And that's been my point of frustration, which is why I'm always so vocal about, we're not in HR, I'm not in HR, because that's unfortunately what everybody thinks, that when we are DEI practitioners, we only know how to talk about recruiting and ERGs. And we don't have business acumen to understand how the principles of DEI connect to every core function of the rest of this business. When I'm talking to HR, I absolutely want to talk about our processes and the equal application of policy in the workplace and all that good stuff. But when I'm talking to a sales team and sales leadership, I want to talk about market strategies to engage minority depository institutions and community development financial institutions. I want to talk with our product teams, our technical teams, to really think through what are those features, again, that we could build that would lead to more equitable outcomes, and how are we actually measuring the success and the efficacy of those items. And that's where we have to mature as a practice, with it both as individuals and within our respective organizations, to move the organization along this very complex and long journey that we've talked about, to get to that place, to see that it's well beyond just the typical metrics we think about, whether it's just the recruiting numbers and anything else.
Absolutely.
I have so many, I was looking for the reactions as well, Ulysses, but DK, Ulysses, hit. When I'm thinking about this particular question, going back to the George Floyd piece and what 2020 really did for us, something that I'm overly impressed with from both the macro and the micro perspective is the language that it provided us to get comfortable with in order to have the conversations within our organizations. If you think about it, folks weren't even talking about this on this scale before. And it was in large part due to the fact that people just weren't comfortable saying some of the words that needed to be said in order for folks to have the authentic conversation. Generational wealth gaps, racism, right? Like, these words are trigger words for a number of corporate organizations. And so 2020 really pushed us past a lot of that so that we can look at leaders in the company now and say, here's how we talk about this. And it's really important that you exemplify your knowledge and understanding about it, but also how it ties back to the business and what we're doing here. And we've seen such exponential change when those leaders actually do take up that opportunity and start speaking about it, because it matriculates through the business to all the folks who are in there. Again, leaning on this empathy, folks won't always say the right thing, but so long as they're confident enough to start saying something, it gives us a lot of room to work. And that's what I've been overly impressed by, especially when we're thinking about that engagement. Because when we do those surveys and when we get that information back, it really does talk to the fact that people feel more comfortable at the organization when they're able to talk about themselves more wholeheartedly, especially from an inclusion perspective. And it's been so powerful for those folks to start being seen with the appropriate language. Pronouns, like when we talk about the small things that have major impact, pronouns are now being talked about en masse. They're being put into signatures. They're being spoken about first and foremost in meetings. We have community rule engagements when we get into meetings to talk about what is the appropriate exchange of engagement that we have here. Folks are really keen on being inclusive, which making folks feel and know that there are different means of communication, whether it's through typing through the chat or it's speaking, keeping cameras off. 2020, 2021 with COVID has been a really hard year, and it's made it overly appropriate with this inclusive language for folks to say, you know, I'm a little burnt out today, I'm gonna turn off my camera. And that's appropriate. It's no longer this micromanagement of we need to have all of our cameras on because in this remote place, we just don't know, or at least for the time being, as we are working mostly in a virtual setting. And so there's been so many amazing changes, but when we talk about these numbers, this is the engagement that we're starting to see that's impactful in the way of folks feeling like they're seen and can stick around. And I think that goes beyond that talent acquisition piece that Ulysses was saying, right? It's how are folks feeling empowered? And then what are we doing internally to help folks feel like they can excel through the company and continue to grow? And things that we focused on are stuff like internal mobility. During COVID, we were really keen on not letting any of our folks go and making sure that there are transitional pieces for them to stay within the company, because we believe in that equity. We believe in folks being able to have those transferable skills. And it's really important as a whole conversation that is now collective throughout the org for people to be talking about this. And we've done this in large parts through function-based programming. So again, Ulysses hit. When you're talking with your marketing team, how are they showing up for the conversation specifically to them and putting the language from a diverse perspective in a way that makes sense for their folks to be focused on how to help the business be more forthcoming about their inclusion practices? How is engineering picking this up? How is legal picking this up? How are people picking this up? Et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't want to keep going on, but these are the ways we're seeing the changes really come through from the, and I almost am tempted not to say this word, but I am, because of the impact, the gift of the language we've received to be able to use during this time. Now that we've gone through the stress of 2020 and the burnout of 2021, and we're now at a place where we're thinking more collectively about inclusion practices.
Excellent.
Back to DK, what you started with, just that piece on behavior. Yeah, same thing, just like all the collapse, all the reactions. I wish we could be pressing button. But one thing I've been thinking about recently is how like that's like the business of what we are trying to do is influence human behavior. And a lot of times, I don't know if you have this, all those on the call, but sometimes when you talk to people, you tell them what you do, it's like, oh, wow, like that's such glamorous work. And then at the end of the day, like I'm looking, I'm like, okay, I appreciate that you think that, but this work, I mean, we're trying to literally change and influence human behavior, talk about something that is extremely challenging. And especially with the type of roles that we have, where we oftentimes have to influence from the side or from behind rather than sort of this top-down model. And then even Ash, you made me kind of think of what's so unique about what the opportunity is right now is within this D&I space, we have touch points in so many aspects of the business. So the legal team all of a sudden wants to get our feedback, and then the sales teams, and then the engineering teams. And so just to think about the moment that we're in, where we have this chance to influence and maybe move people away from thinking, well, can you share the data of why this is going to impact positively the business and the bottom line? It's like we have that chance now to actually have that conversation and maybe take it to this behavioral empathy type of conversation to maybe lead to some more real systemic change happening across the business.
Excellent.
I was also looking for the reactions too. I did not know on Zoom webinar you cannot do that. So an interesting product adjustment I'll be submitting to them. But everyone obviously presented some really key points here in terms of the point that we're in and just the language that we have to move forward. And a couple people mentioned just the role of leaders. Leaders are saying more about topics that, relate to their team, about world events, about legislation, about all the different things that are happening outside of the microcosm of our company, and along the lines of leading with empathy and leading into hard conversations, being vulnerable. From executive leadership standpoint, and also I would extend this to people managers, you don't really know how people identify you. Your identity is not always shown. So anything could really impact all of your employees. So sometimes people are like, how do I know what to say or engage in this conversation or check in on people? Oftentimes you don't talk to the CEO on a daily basis. So it is around those emails or the LinkedIn post or whatever form of mass communication it is. So I guess my question is, how do you advise executive leaders and also people managers to have these conversations? And I'm going to give kind of an example too around also the next step of taking action if they feel it's related to their company or something that they believe in, like we saw with Bumble, Match, Uber, and Lyft, really doubling down in Texas with the anti-abortion law, offering their services because this is something they believe in. So that next step from action. It's a big question, but something I was thinking about while you were talking.
Well, Gary makes apparently the work look glamorous, so maybe you should start.
I have a great poker face, apparently. Oh, let's see. Well, I'm reminded of a previous company I worked at, a larger technology company here in the States. For 2 years, there was a team that their role was just to study the culture and to try and help figure out how are we actually going to make true culture shift within this organization. So 2 years goes by, they come out with two key things that they feel like if we want to actually see systemic culture change happen, we have to address two things. One is connecting people across their differences. So figuring out a way that we can help connect people human to human and start to make more interactions and authentic conversations, relationships in that kind of way. And the second was addressing our people managers and empowering them to actually do the thing they're already doing, which is stewarding the culture. So I think we've all heard the phrase, people don't leave managers, they don't leave companies, they leave managers. And I think that's largely very, very true, and qualitative data would probably show us that, right? So I think we recognize that. So then the question is, how do we actually do that? How do we empower? How do we start to hold accountable the different leaders and executives and these folks who are holding all of the influence around our culture? So, I mean, we could talk about this for probably hours, but just thinking about like what type of learning path is there for our managers? What's actually in place for performance reviews and the way that we think about rewards and recognition for the folks who are holding so much power within our culture. So there's a couple of spaces that I'm really trying to lean into right now to create some more like systemic type of solutions that I'm hopeful can lead to long-term change, rather than thinking about, like, let's just hold like a one-time training opportunity and hope that people show up and these managers show up. It's like we have to think a little bit more intentionally and long-term if we're actually going to see the type of change we want to see.
I appreciate that. Going to the conversation piece about leaders particularly, I was having a conversation with our CEO, and this was maybe about 6 months ago or so, possibly a year. I mean, heaven knows what day it is, but we were talking in his office, and virtual office. We were still virtual at that time. And he asked the question of, Ash, there's so much that I want to do here. And I know where we are, and I know what needs to be done. How do I do that? And it was the most sincere question I've ever heard. And the fact that it was coming from our CEO just made this more impactful. Ken is such a personable individual, and he's very mindful about the impact that we have, not only from a product perspective, but internally. Credit Karma, we're Karmanauts, and he's really about knowing how we can continue to make progress. And I said, can I answer very directly? And he said, absolutely. I wouldn't expect anything less, give or take, a few words. And I said, jump in the pool, jump in the pool. And I think that there's very few spaces where we're able to empower folks to really just give it a go. And I think that this is one of the places where it matters the most. And he was such an example to so many leaders at our company, C-suite all the way to the leaders we have within all levels of the company, because our very next Karma update, he made sure to make a declaration to our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. And it was almost like he needed that permission really to just do it, but he already knew he could. And I think a lot of folks, especially leaders, are trying to figure that out. And sometimes it is about creating an inclusive leadership program to help folks understand this is your arena. Manager programs and cohorts saying, this is what you do here. You already, as Gary was saying, you already shepherd these individuals through their career trajectories. On top of that, there is an additional leadership facet that is foundational here, and it's to be inclusive, to see them and to assist them in their journey. I love what DK said in the beginning about this journey that we're on and the amount of time we're going to be on it, which means that wherever you are, it is appropriate for you to jump in that pool and continue moving wherever it leads you. But the most important part about that is making the progress.
Yeah, I love the jumping in the pool analogy, because when you jump in the pool, you get wet, right? Which means you have an experience, and guess what? You start to dry off, right? So you begin anew. At Moody's, we call it a toolkit, and we basically, it's the way I would view it about having those conversations is we'll guide you, but you have to own it. So we don't say jump at the pool, but we say you've got to own it. And the reason behind that is that everybody has a different style. So part of my job is to say, this is what to do and this is what not to do, right? But this is what you're really trying to accomplish. And I'm going to give you the guidance around it. So for the most part, we create toolkits, but I want you to be able to have those conversations, very continuous, as well as doing things like if you're looking to hire a diverse person, don't just go to HR or talent acquisition and think they're going to do the whole thing for you. You need to get on LinkedIn, go to your alumni, go to your network, et cetera. There are all these things that you could do, right? What you're not going to do is when something goes wrong, well, talent acquisition never gave me the candidate. That's not the way DE&I works. I think we all have experienced that. So for us, it's about giving some guidance, similar to everyone else here. I've had some really senior people, not at Moody's thus far, the example I'm about to give you, but at other companies, I've had some really senior people come into my office and they're bawling. I'm not a misogynist, and I've had both men and women, to be clear. I'm not a misogynist, or I'm not a racist, or I have LGBT people in my family. And I'm sitting there like, okay, and what does this have to do with the problem that we're trying to address? And I walk them through it, right? And mind you, this is very often people who've already gone through DE&I training. And then they have this aha moment that, yeah, you got to be the one to fix this. I could tell you whatever and give you 1,000 examples. So I think a big part of what we do is give guidance. We give a FAQ, a toolkit, et cetera. Those things are proven to work. But in DE&I, as a manager, as a leader, you have to do the work. If you don't do the work, guess what? It won't work.
Shocking. And the flashbacks that just flew through my mind.
Can only imagine.
Some of the things you were saying, I was, I was like reflecting over the last few years, especially many other organizations I've come to resent only being engaged when there's a crisis, right? And so I try to make it very clear, like I'm always going to be here as a strategic partner to you. Don't ever engage me only when there's a crisis involved, right? Because at that point, right, don't bring me into your troubles. That's not on me. I told you water was wet. You chose to do the opposite of what I said, and treat it like it was dry. So, but I think there are two levels. And Gary, you talked about performance management, which I think we should talk about a bit. Going back to the concept of behaviors again. How are you assessing and reinforcing and rewarding or discouraging certain behaviors, right? And Ash, I think you alluded to it as well. That's critical. And when you don't have an organization who hires for values alignment, when you don't have an organization who doesn't have very clear competencies and the behaviors that are meant to be in place to support those competencies, and people don't know how it is that they're supposed to comport themselves in that space, and they go do all types of things, right? There's a recipe for disaster. And so we have to think more critically, and this is where there's a key partnership with HR especially, to really work to define what those competencies are and how we actually put in an effective performance management system for both people managers and frankly, everybody else at the organization. And like DK said, we also put together toolkits and various resources and things like that for people to be able to help navigate various circumstances, because the reality is I can't drop everything I'm doing every 15 minutes to answer a question about whether or not you should say this term or the other term. Sometimes you got to Google it yourself. Right, that's not on me to do. I have other things to do with my time, to be honest. But the other thing I would say there is we've been launching an Equity and Inclusion Institute to develop these kind of curated journeys on specific topics for people to take them and develop this entire learning model that's overlaid with an intercultural maturity model to take people from this place of just kind of closed to curious to ultimately capable, right? And what does that look like both at a cognitive level, an intrapersonal level, and an interpersonal level, right? And what does progression and success look like everywhere from I'm just building self-awareness when I come into Blend U and we do a social identity profile before Ulysses ever talks to you about Blend's D&I strategy, all the way to how I'm impacting others and how my social identity and all the groups that I belong to interacts with systems and structures. And ultimately, what's my role and responsibility when it comes to creating culture? And how does my behavior lend to creating culture on teams? At the executive level, it's really important that, again, I'm not called on in crisis and we give people the opportunity to show up as champions, right? And to let people think some of these things are their ideas. Go and hold it through.
There
So
you go.
all of our, there you go, like, right? All departments, all executive leader led departments have, they're charged with launching 3 specific measurable objectives around our 3 pillars in DIV. So talent, experience, and impact. And you know, the 2 on the end, the bookends, are pretty intuitive: talent acquisition and then external impact when they think CSR type work. But the experience piece is really challenging, has proven to be very challenging for a lot of leaders. And I tell them this has to be connected to a measurable dimension of the engagement survey, whether that's growth and development, whether that is alignment, leadership, other things that people haven't quite thought about, because that's how we actually get to what you're talking about and getting to this culture of accountability around, for leadership around DEI work broadly. But you have to put in actual mechanisms to make that happen and to keep people accountable for delivering against those items.
Absolutely.
And
About that change. Go ahead, Ash.
I'll just say, and I'll just add one more thing, just a small thing. Making accountability a product of everyone's engagements. I think that empowering all folks to be able to assist their peers in being better without it being chastisement, but more so encouragement. And that is a huge shift in that empathy side of, we're all in this together. We're on this journey, and our community rules state that it's okay for me to say or disagree so long as I help with us move through a particular process or problem. I find that that's really important, especially at those leadership levels where we're looking at what does accountability look like. It looks like you being open to feedback that folks have about your lack of inclusive language, and being okay with hearing that and recognizing there are resources for you to go to be able to educate yourself more on the right direction to go. Or on the reverse, with that reverse mentorship that you're talking about, well, I guess that was reverse mentorship, but on a mentorship note, helping those folks who are new at the organization understand what those foundational elements of leadership look like and mean in an inclusive way, and assisting them in continually looking at what are our choices and how are we implementing them. For example, who wants to be lost when they get to an organization and not know that it is up to them, and if there is an empowerment piece that they have to move through their leadership inclusively. And so it's a give and take, and it 100% is about peership and empathy and empowering folks to be accountable to themselves and to one another.
Absolutely.
Hold yourself accountable, hold others accountable. I think these are all questions that you pose to that we can all ask ourselves, whether we are in marketing, sales, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, whatever role. We do have an anonymous question someone asked around, I'm interested in DEI and aware that a lot of POC, people of color, take on a lot of emotional labor in these spaces. Is it important for diversity, equity, inclusion professionals to identify personally from an underrepresented person? Would I be taking up space if I was in this role?
I appreciate that. I think it's a thoughtful question. What I appreciate the most about you asking it is that you asked it, but it demonstrates a level of awareness and introspection that you have, right? As you're reflecting on identity, generally, who am I? What am I bringing? How do I show up? And how do I end up showing up in certain spaces to some people? So let me be clear. No, you don't need to identify as a person of color in order to be a DEI practitioner. What I think absolutely is, and what we should say at the outset here, is we all possess both target identities and agent identities, right? That is how social identity works. And I invite folks to check out, the cycle of socialization, Bobby Harrow's work. I encourage folks to really dive into, if you want a great foundational book on social identity, Beverly Daniel Tatum, like Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria, right? Let's, read that, because it gives some insights into just the social identity development, which I think are necessary in order to have these conversations effectively as a practitioner. What I think is incredibly true is that we do take on, by default, you end up absorbing a lot of other people's trauma because folks often come to you to be the person to solve the things, right? And sometimes the hard part is when you don't have the agency to solve said thing, but you can at least help coach somebody through something. right? And again, goes back to sometimes it has to do with other people's behaviors and the work that they have to do, and not necessarily you. I do think you should be prepared as a practitioner for the long haul here. What I don't think is often covered in many of the, and I'm not going to name names, of some of the new certificate programs that everybody's taking these days. One may or may not have come from an institution I may have worked at, but what happens is, catch that T. What happens is we talk all about the HR angle and just like talent acquisition stuff, and then we never actually equip practitioners to understand that this is a lot of change management work. It is a lot of influencing without authority. It is a lot. There's so much else you have to navigate that I don't think people are quite prepared for when they enter into this. And yes, it requires emotional intelligence. It requires cultural competency. It requires an openness to learning and making mistakes, because you absolutely will make mistakes. I make them every single day, right? That's how we learn. And just as, you know, Ash, I loved how you were really talking about that feedback with this. To me, that is demonstrative of what this work is all about, right? When we're doing this, because it is a lot of behavior change. So that was a very long-winded answer to no, you don't need to be a person of color to be in this role. But you should really take care to understand those experiences.
I know I'm chatty pants, but I'm gonna just say one other thing on that is going back to that accountability piece and it being something that everyone is empowered to. You don't have to be a DEI specialist or someone within DEI to do this work. And I want everyone to have that, because the reality is where you're situated, this is a lift where you stand, right? If you're in this organization, your span of control is important for you to understand that that includes inclusive practices, diversifying your space, and making sure that you're building equity into whatever programs that you're building at the company. This is a part of the diversity initiative, is making sure everyone understands what facets of their space are empowered by their inclusive choices. And it's a reflective item to help them understand what education they need to be taking on in order to do that. And the organization can be on board with making sure that education opportunities are provided. But this is also that homework we need to be doing all collectively, right? I think 2020 was very important, where you couldn't go on a scrolling party with Instagram without reading something about how to be an inclusive person or mindful of diversity. Continue that. I love Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together at the, what was it? Why Are the Black Kids Sitting Together? That's all I'll say, because I don't remember the rest of the title because it's super long, but we read that as a book club. We had collective learning around this topic to make sure that we were all going on this journey together. And then everyone went home and found their own space that was pertinent to what they did at the company and why it was important for them to internalize some of these messages. We can all do this work. You don't have to be in DEI to do it. You don't have to be in HR. And this is something I can't go forward and say without my boss getting on me about. I love, love, love my boss. And she is always mindful about the fact that this isn't HR or DEI's problem to solve solely. This is all of ours. We need to make sure that we're continuing that message forward. And again, holding folks accountable. It really does come down to accountability and making sure we do have actionable direction forward so that we can bring about the inclusion that we talk about.
Yeah. So wholeheartedly agree with that. And note to self, Ash, I want to be a part of your Instagram, because I'm on Instagram, I have lots of followers, but no one talks about DE&I. It's seriously, my LinkedIn now, totally different story. I can't get away from it. But I thought that was interesting that you said it was all over Instagram, because I've been looking and that's not what they talk about. It's a whole nother kind of thing. So we'll do that another time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But on a really serious note, and this is really a good question because I get asked it all the time. So no, you don't have to be a person of color. No, you don't have to be a woman. No, you don't have to be an LGBT person. And no, you don't have to have accessibility, disability issues. But what you do have to have is what I would like to call a passion around humanity. And I say that quite purposefully because, and I'll use the example, a lot of us, you know, in general, have worked with human resources professionals that are not very humane. And it's the same thing with DE&I. I mean, picture it, right? You have a HR person that really could care less about the person or their development, and it's just a systematic process for them, right? And I often equate being a DE&I person to being a doctor. I don't want to go to a doctor who may be the best surgeon ever, but the very core of how they speak to me or sitting in their chair makes me shake because they have no empathy. They don't look at me in the eyes. They're just reading from something, right? Like, that's the similar thing with DE&I. You could spot someone in DE&I right away who either doesn't know what they're talking about or is just not really good because it's very programmatic. And that's not what we want. So if you're gonna go into this career, the first thing you must understand is, do I like people? Do people like me, right? I mean, it sounds cliche-ish or it's really simple, but it's not, because there's good D&I and then there's bad D&I, just like anything else in life.
I think that was a very good answer. Do I like people and do people like me? Questions I ask myself as well. One more question from the audience, and then I know we are wrapping up the last couple of minutes, but the question is it my responsibility to point out every time another manager in a different department is not being inclusive, especially since I'm more junior, but they have a lot of work to do? Or should I just move on to a place or company where the manager isn't?
So I'm going to say the answer is yes. People may disagree with me. The issue becomes, how do you point that out, right? Like, and that's why I apologize for going back to this, but this is why we go back to the reverse mentoring. Because when you do something like that, it's all of these aha moments that come out like, oh my God, I never thought of that. Oh my God, this person is from this university and I can relate. There are all these aha moments. So you need to, because that's what inclusivity and DE&I is all about. It's what you don't know. It's about the other. It's about what you're not comfortable with, etc. But you need to engage. If you're a junior person, I wouldn't run up to that person or send them an email and say, well, you're not a inclusive person, etc. But you may want to engage them and say, hey, when you said this, I felt a certain way, or let's have a conversation about, what that is. You would be so impressed or moved how just doing something that small makes a big difference, because you're allowing someone to really learn something and look at what they're doing, that self-assessment, in a much more thoughtful, focused way, as opposed to being reactive. You're being responsive.
And I'll just add on to that. So sorry, was someone else jumping in? Reacting to that. So, and there's so many ways that you can do this. I remember when AAPI hate was really moving through the bulk of the tragedy that was going on with the Asian community, one of the bystander trainings that came out was talking about the 5 Ds of bystander, like being a bystander. And I think that I'm pointing to that specifically because when we're talking about being a bystander, it's also about being an interrupter. It's also about being someone who is holding folks accountable. And that could be both from a physical sense, or it can be from an in the office, non-confrontational, but definitely being accountable to making sure that progress is happening. And it goes through 5 ways you can interrupt whatever bias you're seeing happen. And it can be anywhere from you hand that off to someone else to take accountability for, or you yourself are the person who takes it on individually. But there's many different ways we can do that. We can ask a question back. What did you mean? I love asking the question, what did you mean by that? Because it puts it back on the person who's doing the thing. And it makes them actually think about what they're saying or what they're doing that's potentially problematic. And then being willing to be there with them for that conversation. But then also, I don't hold folks to account when it comes to if they're in a situation that might be harmful. The piece about that question that I want to notate that's important is the level. We know that there is difference in level and there's different privileges that come along with that. And so this goes with the organization and how they're creating a space of safety for folks from different and varying levels to be able to contest their upward management. Or if that's not possible where you are, the question, the follow-up to the question was, should I leave? I think it's really about what is the social expectation of folks to be able to be that advocate. And can you actually be an associate without being someone who puts their job in jeopardy? Because we need to be realistic. It's 2021. There's a lot going on with COVID. Folks are holding on to their jobs and they really want to make sure they have that level of security. And so we want to make sure, of course, there's progress happening, but then there's also tools and mechanisms that folks can use to assist them through the progress they want to see.
All right. Thank you so much. I hope that was helpful to the two folks who answered the question. And I know we have 3 minutes left, so I want to give everyone a chance to give some folks who are listening live into kind of our on-demand webinar a call to action that you hope that they take with them after listening to our webinar today. This can be if you are in an informal, formal leadership role. A lot of people who are listening are culture champions in every sense of the word. So if everyone can give their call to action, that would be great, and we'll head off. TK, we could start with you and go Ulysses, Gary, and Ash.
Be the change that you want to be. You know, you can't change the world, but one person can make a difference.
Be as glamorous as Gary is apparently in this work. No. No, DK, I've enjoyed it, listening to you. Your laugh gets me every time. But I think my big call to action for folks is to think critically and to take calculated risks and push your organization to definitely make more critical connections between the principles around DE&I work and every other part of the business. That's the only way we're going to move forward, is if we adopt a mentality where we know and where we sincerely believe and act on the idea that we can actually make a difference if we go well beyond just the typical framing of this practice.
I'll go back to something DK said at the beginning about the journey. I think just what I would say is have empathy for the journey. That's your own personal journey with where you are. There's always something, a blind spot that you are going to have, that I'm going to have, but continue on that journey. And then also remember to have empathy with others who are at a different place in that journey. And ask the question, what can you do to help them take that one click forward of progress?
I love that empathy piece, but I would say twofold: jump in the pool and lift where you stand. And I think that's all I'll say.
Let's get wet.
Ash, DK, Ulysses, Gary, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it, and for our audience for listening. And to reiterate, if you have any questions around employee feedback management, please don't hesitate to reach out, and have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world.